And it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today. There's clearly lots of interest in this topic. We will be recording this session and we email it out afterwards. So if you're not able to stay for the full or you want to share it or send it to others, please feel free to do that. I am very pleased to be welcoming Kirsten Delegard. She's the director and one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project, which is located in the Borchert Map Library at the University of Minnesota. She's a third generation Minneapolitan. Did I say
Minneapolitan,
that?
yeah.
That's a good new word for me, and public historian. To explore the complex history of her hometown, she established Mapping Prejudice as well as the Historyapolis Project. Delegard is a graduate of Minneapolis Public Schools and Wesleyan University. She also holds a Ph.D. in history from Duke University, where she spent her graduate school years exploring American social movements, comparative women's history, and the history of women in politics in the United States. She also has a faculty affiliation with the Department of Geography, Environment and Society, and the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the University of Minnesota. Very impressive. Welcome, Kirsten.
Well, thank you for having me. And thanks for those of you who told me that you're going to leave at 1, so I won't feel worried that I suddenly am driving folks away. And I should also say that my boss, Lisa German, who's the dean of the library at the University of Minnesota, is going to be joining us at 12:30. She's new to the area. She just moved here from Texas, and she lives in Golden Valley. So I suggested that she come and meet all of you as a way of sort of getting acclimated in her new community. And I also, since we have folks from Hopkins, I want to say that we're doing an event on Thursday night in Hopkins virtually. With the Hopkins Racial Equity and Inclusion Initiative, so that might be interesting to some of you. Okay, so without further ado, what is Mapping Prejudice? We started in 2016, and in the last couple of years, I've given dozens of talks about our research, about the history of housing discrimination in Hennepin County. We started out in Minneapolis. And I would say that over time, our data set got bigger and my warnings got sharper the more I did this. And my message went something like this. We have the highest racial disparities in the country. It's unjust, but it's also unsustainable. I caution people that I worry that these disparities, these inequities, were going to tear our community apart. And then, of course, as all of you know, on May 25th, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And from this corner at 38th and Chicago, demonstrations and civil unrest spread around the country and then around the world. And what began here in Minneapolis has actually mushroomed into what observers are now calling the largest protest movement in American history. So 25 million Americans have taken to the streets in support of Black Lives Matter. So in the wake of these events, Mapping Prejudice has actually been fielding inquiries from around the world, from people who want to know why this all started in Minneapolis. So I think that's a question that we're all going to be thinking about for years to come. But our team was happy in this moment of challenge for our community to be able to speak to one piece of this question, the history of racial covenants, and what I have come to think of as the willful amnesia around the history of discriminatory housing practices in Minneapolis. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I think it's important to start with some statistics. In the Twin Cities, we have the highest gap in the country between Black and white homeownership rates for any major metropolitan area. What does that mean? It means that 75% of white families own their homes and only 23% of Black families can make that same claim. We could go, this would be a whole separate presentation, but what we know is that this home ownership gap and this housing gap really undergirds a whole raft of other racial disparities that afflict our community. Housing is so important because it sits at the foundation of everything else. It determines whether you're going to be healthy or sick, what kind of education you're going to have access to, and whether or not your family is going to have stability, whether your family is going to be able to amass wealth over time. Since 2016, my team at Mapping Prejudice has been presenting a question. How did we get to this place, right? If Minnesota is such a great place to live, and I believe that, how did we develop such a huge gap in this critical area? What did we do wrong? And of course, what can we do differently in the future? Our team, which is a diverse team of people with a lot of complementary skills, came together around the desire to show one thing in particular, which is that these contemporary racial disparities that we have today are not the result of some natural order. And we've been doing this by leading community members in the construction of a map that illuminates how developers used racial covenants at a critical moment in our community history to reserve huge swaths of land in Hennepin County for the exclusive use of white people. So I'm going to pause here for a definition. Racial covenants, which are what we map, are legal clauses that are inserted into property deeds. And here in the Twin Cities, real estate developers first started using racial covenants in 1910. This is the first deed. This is the 1910 deed. This is the first deed that we found that has this kind of restriction. You can see the language here. It says that the party of the first part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. This was written by a man named Edmund Walton. He ran something called the Seven Oaks Corporation, which was a real estate development firm. Their firm alone put this language into thousands and thousands of deeds across the Twin Cities. And these clauses, as I said, were attached to new land that was being developed to keep people who are not white from buying homes, but even occupying a land. The language varies, but it's always racist. I'm going to read you some other examples. And I want to forewarn you that the language is disturbing, so prepare yourself, take a breath. It's hard to hear this, but we do this because we think it's very important for people to really confront what this language really sounds like. So no person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race. And no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. So I've just shared with you 4 examples. We've found several hundred different variations on this language, but the intent is always the same. And we make a point of reading these deeds aloud in public because we think it's very important to make sure that we're not treating racism with evasion or euphemism, which is the way Americans traditionally have talked about race. That racism, of course, is not going to disappear if we ignore it, and that we need to confront this hard history, this truth, if we want to move forward into justice. So if you look at the history of housing, this question of racial covenants jumps out. Right? They were so outrageous, they were so blatant, and they were used in every community in the country. Small towns, big cities, we haven't found a town that did not have racial covenants. And in fact, by the 1930s, the federal government was making these covenants, the use of these covenants, a precondition for any kind of public underwriting of development. So, and over the last century, there's nothing secret about these covenants. They've been examined in dozens of books, in plays, movies, poetry, art. They were the subject of, I have, you can see the bookshelves behind me. I have so many, countless studies done about covenants, surveys, court cases, including the landmark Shelley v. Kramer case before the US Supreme Court. But even with all that, there's so much that we don't know about these restrictions. In our quest to figure out how we got here, our team just wanted answers to some really basic questions. What did these covenants actually say? Where were they used? How common were they? How much land did they cover? And all of these things were things that scholars had not been able to answer. So we decided to do this research in an unconventional way. We harnessed the power of community to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American community. And our project has been leading people from all kinds of backgrounds in the work of mapping these restrictions. We use computers to comb through millions of property records to flag the documents that seem to have this language. And then we use a crowdsourcing platform to pull in volunteers. And for our Hennepin County map, we had 3,000 volunteers read 177,000 historic property deeds. And that corpus of volunteers found 24,000 property parcels that had these racial restrictions on them. So take a look. This is what they found. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing the spread of racial covenants throughout Hennepin County over time. So each one of these blue dots denotes an individual property parcel that was reserved exclusively for the use of white people. So as I said, all the blue, when the map reaches the end of its, there's the time-lapse map ticks to the end, you'll see the 24,000 property parcels that we've been able to identify. So no one, as I said, no one has ever created a map like this before. And as we built it in collaboration with community, we found the map and the process to be a really powerful vehicle for policymaking, for research, and also for these kinds of community conversations that we're having today. So, so the text that I shared with you shows how racist these deeds are, unequivocally racist, right? The map is meant to show that these documents they're not unique. They're not isolated. They're part of a larger pattern, right? But it's also important to understand how powerful these deeds are. And I know there are several lawyers on the call too who can chime in with more about this. But covenants, once they were put into place, they ran with the land, which meant that they were there forever once they were put into place. It didn't matter how many times the property changed hands. It didn't matter what was torn down or what was built on that land. Once that land had this kind of racial restriction on it, it was there forever. And anyone who breached these covenants, anyone who dared to defy the restrictions that were written in these clauses, risked losing the property, risked ending up in court. By law, the property could go back to the person who put the covenant in place in the first place if someone dared to breach the covenant. So in the case of Edmund Walton, who died in 1919, any of his properties, if someone breached the covenant on them, they would go to his heirs. So the point is that very few people were willing to take that kind of risk and lose all the equity that they had accumulated in a certain piece of property. But one of the painful truths about covenants is that they were very popular among white people. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants rightly as a threat to basic liberty. So here in the Twin Cities, we have leaders like Nellie Francis, a well-known suffragist, Madison Jackson, Lena Olive Smith, James Wardlaw, Katie McWatt, and they devoted their lives to fighting these practices. All over the country, Black people put everything on the line to challenge them. They bought houses with covenants. They moved into white neighborhoods. that's what the Lee family did in 1931. Arthur and Edith Lee. They bought a tiny white bungalow in the summer of 1931 on a corner in South Minneapolis. And after they moved into their house with their young daughter Mary, they found themselves under attack. So the neighbors came to them, and they pleaded with them and then threatened them, and demanded that they leave. And then they organized a mob, which basically laid siege around the Lee house for most of the summer of 1931. One neighbor described it this way: 6,000 white people who showed up to surround the home, terrorize the family, waiting to see the house burn down. So this photo I put up on the screen here shows Mary with her mother in front of their new house after one of these attacks. You can see the black paint that the mob threw on the side of the house. You can see the broken window in the upper right-hand corner. The house still stands at 46th and Columbus, and you can see it today because Arthur was able to draw on his friends and other veterans who worked with him at the downtown post office. They formed an armed perimeter around the house that protected the family and kept the house from being burned. But they couldn't protect the family from violence. The Lees had to move into the basement because so many people were throwing things through the window, shooting through the window. Mary had to have a police escort to get to kindergarten. One day when she was at school, someone killed her dog. Arthur was arrested after trying to drive off vandals several times. The Lee home didn't have a covenant, but it was right on the edge of a restricted neighborhood. And in these years, the proliferation of these covenants normalized the ideas that led to these attacks and led to the police being unwilling to intervene in this situation. According to the logic of covenants, the Lees posed an existential threat to this neighborhood. It's at this moment of great crisis in the city. So as these racial boundaries hardened in American cities, this threat of white violence was always present. This was one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. Folks didn't bother going to court; they just called together a mob. So covenants are illegal today. They were made illegal through a series of court decisions, starting with Shelley v. Kramer in 1948 and laws ending with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But we're still living with the legacies of these practices. What did covenants do? They transformed what was a relatively integrated, relatively mixed city into a racially segregated city. Covenants emboldened white Minneapolitans to harass Black residents like the Lees. Black residents were pushed into a couple of small neighborhoods in Minneapolis, and as new neighborhoods came online, they were restricted with covenants. There are still the whitest areas in Minneapolis today. The neighborhoods that didn't have covenants were redlined. That's the federal practice that declared neighborhoods that were racially mixed to be hazardous for lenders. This choked off capital to those areas. So these two things, redlining and covenants, worked together to make it really hard for people who are not white to find stable, decent, affordable housing. It made it really hard for people who are not white to buy houses. And of course, this is important for all the reasons that I talked about at the beginning. It determines so much about your well-being and what your housing is like. And of course, it's critical as an avenue for wealth accumulation. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. I think it's also important to understand that this story is in no way unique to Minneapolis. This reshuffling by race was happening in every community across the country at the same time. Blacks, in the words of the poet Langston Hughes, were hemmed in. That's the title of a poem he wrote in 1949, where he said, "They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free." So 71 years later, Black people are still struggling to breathe in Minneapolis. Please, 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 I can't breathe. That's what George Floyd pleaded as he lay pinned under the knee of a police officer. And I think it's important for us to realize that the death of George Floyd grows out of the structural racism that's so entrenched in Minneapolis. So as Michelle talked about in the beginning, I'm a third generation Minneapolitan. I embarked on this work in part to marry in some ways my professional and my personal lives, but I didn't quite appreciate how personal this work would get, making this map. At the same time, I quickly discovered that at the same time that residents in South Minneapolis were terrorizing families like the Lees, my grandparents were being welcomed to the city. So my grandparents were from immigrant families with roots in Sweden. It's important to acknowledge the fact that they didn't start their adult lives with a lot in the way of advantages in terms of money or education. Two of my grandparents were orphaned at very young ages. I think it was only one of my grandparents who made it to the 8th grade. But what they did have, like a lot of immigrants, they had a capacity for hard work, and they worked in all kinds of capacities around the region as lumberjacks, as domestic servants, as carpenters. They tried homesteading, and then they decided to come to the big city in search of opportunity, and they found it. During the Great Depression, they built businesses, they got married, they saved their money. And in 1942, both sets of my grandparents were able to buy houses. So this is a home film that my grandfather actually commissioned a film crew to record the day that my father's family became property owners. This was such a big deal in my family. So my uncle had it digitized and put it up on YouTube. You can all watch more than 2 hours of it. And it's clear that they invited everyone that they'd ever known to come and celebrate their good fortune and this happy moment. But thanks to our map, I now know that this house was located on a block that was blanketed by racial covenants, that the house itself had a racial covenant. My mom's family lived nearby, and it's the same story there. Her block was also carpeted with these same kind of discriminatory deeds. So although my grandparents were new arrivals to this country, they were regarded as white. And that meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans with similar incomes and similar education levels. So I grew up visiting my grandparents' houses, spending weekends with my grandparents. I grew up hearing stories from my parents about what it was like being kids in this neighborhood around Lake Nokomis. My parents describe how they spent all their time outdoors in the parks, by swimming in the lake, exploring the creek, and really critically, the neighborhood had really solid schools. So both of my parents went to college, even though their parents had not made it to the 8th grade, right? And my mother actually went to graduate school. My parents say that they never questioned why their neighbors were all Swedish, Norwegian, and German, that this uniform whiteness seemed utterly natural to them, even at a moment in time in the city when the number of people of color was really climbing. And my grandparents bought their homes at a critical moment for the United States, just as the country was about to see the largest expansion of the middle class in its history. Much of this prosperity, of course, rested on this new access to homeownership, because the federal government had deliberately supported homeownership with new programs in the 1930s that basically invented the modern mortgage, put homeownership within reach for people of modest means. But these same federal programs also introduced redlining. And these discriminatory policies meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. So these programs were created to benefit people like my grandparents, and like the GI Bill, they excluded people who were not white. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged to buy houses in a part of the city where property values climbed throughout most of the 20th century. And our research has shown that more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act made these covenants illegal, houses in Minneapolis that had covenants, like the ones owned by my grandparents, are worth 15% more than identical houses that did not have covenants. And my grandparents were able to pass this additional value to me. When my grandfather died, my family sold his house and distributed the proceeds to the grandchildren. I used my portion to put a down payment on a house in another part of South Minneapolis that I could have never afforded without that help, and a house that gave me access to the things that my parents talked about being so important for them: solid schools, easy access to the chain of lakes. I'm fortunate, but I'm not exceptional in this regard. In 2019, the National Association of Realtors did a study that showed that 30% of first-time homebuyers get this kind of help from their family to manage the purchase of a first home. So like a lot of my peers, I was able to leverage the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of my children. And they are benefiting in so many ways from this. But because I'm a historian, I never let my kids forget the fact that their lives have been shaped in so many ways by the opportunities that were afforded my grandparents, that my grandparents were able to take advantage of. I tell them all the time that we carry our history with us, that none of us are unencumbered. And I want everyone, not just my kids, to see this. That's why we're doing this work. That's why we're making this map. And as we've shared this map, we've discovered that it helps people to see structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. We want people to understand that racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not just people like these protesters who picketed the fair housing hearings in St. Paul in 1962. You know, they make their sentiments really clear on these signs. We want people to understand that this ideology has been embedded into community institutions over decades, that it's actually written into the foundational documents of our community, and that this structural racism undergirds our community maps. It sorts people into zones of privilege and dispossession. And it means that even people who live next door to each other can be sent on very different trajectories according to their race. So why is this history important right now? It's important for us to understand why it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity, which, as I said, affects everything. It affects your health, your educational opportunities, your job prospects, everything. I think it's also important to understand that structural racism is what's undergirding a system that was deliberately built to keep Black and brown people from owning property. It was designed to keep Black bodies out of places that were seen as desirable, and Black bodies out of the spaces that I was taught as a kid growing up in Minneapolis that they belong to everyone. So what are we going to do? I think it's clear that we are at a critical inflection point, right? We have to do something. We need to make amends. We have to remember. That's why we're doing Mapping Prejudice. But then I hand the baton to you, because we have to take action. So here's a place to start. You can help us document this history. We're at work on another map of racial covenants in Ramsey County. I can share how exactly you can get involved, but we have weekly volunteer sessions. We would love to have you. But you know, we want you to read these documents and then share what you've learned with your friends, your family members, with your elected officials. It's up to all of us to make sure that this awareness translates into action. Because one thing I have learned from my work in the archives is that this is not the first time Minneapolis history that there's been a reckoning around race. And I was very moved, and I can point to different moments in time in the 40s and the 60s were again at a critical moment for our community. And I was very moved to read a piece that Jeremiah Ellison wrote in the New York Times this spring, where he said, during every crisis, well-meaning white people here make a ritual of acknowledging the city's steep inequities. It's as if people think that mere acknowledgement is the work. So the work is more than this, but to figure out what we need to change, we need to listen to the people who are most affected, right? One place to start is with the policy agenda of equity in place. It's a coalition, broad coalition of groups, housing justice groups and growth organizations that are led by people of color. You can look there. I can give you other organizations to look at as well. The Homes for All Coalition. There's people who are doing really good work who have really figured out all kinds of concrete policy action that we need to take. But I think it's important to recognize the fact that it's going to cost money, right? We need to invest in housing. We need to invest in schools and people and neighborhoods. But we also have to realize that this work goes beyond money, you know, that it demands moral capital. It demands us all to search within ourselves about what we can do, what we need to do. Reparations, in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, is, quote, the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. It's more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. Reparations, in the words of Coates, is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. And that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. And I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about it. And I would love to hear any questions that you might have. So.
I know there are questions.
There's never not questions.
Jillian, do you want to share yours? I know you just dropped me a little note.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jillian Rosenquist. I'm on the Golden Valley City Council, and I've seen your presentation before, so I apologize for jumping in here late. But one of the things that I'm interested in when we talk about going forward and doing the work to make to kind of remedy some of these systems. Could you talk a little bit, and maybe just give me some references about the impact of kind of post-covenant era zoning laws on segregation and structural racism?
That's a big question. So I think that Maria, do you want to speak to this at all, since you have been sort of in the weeds on looking at policy?
Yeah, so hi again, Mariacisneros, City Attorney. Jillian, that's a really great question, and certainly a question that the city is digging into more. There are a lot of zoning laws, zoning practices, zoning procedures that exacerbate the issues that Kirsten just shared about. And I would say there are definitely patterns of, methods by which we allow people to participate, legal cases that have decided certain standards, for instance, the phrase character of the neighborhood, that become methods that people use to make zoning decisions in a way that excludes people. And the term for this is exclusionary zoning. It's a whole field of study. The city is working, I'm working with the Human Rights Commission and the Planning Department to explore exclusionary zoning in the suburbs and specifically in Golden Valley. And I can promise you, Councilmember Rosenquist, that you will be hearing more from the Human Rights Commission and from me about that topic. It's a very big topic, so, but it's a really great question and definitely something that people should consider when they're participating in the zoning process, and when they're expressing their opinions to their elected officials about zoning issues that those officials are making decisions on, because a lot of this just comes down to what we're willing to accept as the norm and as you know, a valid opinion that maybe is based more on fear than on fact, based on some of the patterns and history that Kirsten described. And so one of the really important things about the educational awareness that Kirsten is talking about is giving people the tools to see these policies and these practices more deeply as, you know, something that is maybe we're practicing out of habit rather than basing on fact.
So I want to add, that's a wonderful, thank you, Maria, for taking that really huge, important question. But I think it's important to understand that zoning policies that we have today emerged at a certain moment in time. Like this is not like, oh, it's always been like this. In Minneapolis, which is where I'm most familiar, single family zoning was adopted across the city the same year that covenants were made illegal. And that's, we don't have a smoking gun to show that, oh, you know, people said we're getting rid of covenants and that's going to open up all kinds of neighborhoods to new people, but that chronology is pretty damning. And what that decision did is that it locked into place the decades of development patterns that had been created by covenants. It put up a new barrier that made it hard, you know, just at that moment where one barrier was coming down to make neighborhoods more diverse, this new barrier went up that you can't, you know, you can't build house, you can't have like multi-family houses in certain neighborhoods. So I think for me, in terms of imagining new policy routes forward, that's always important to understand that the situation that we're living with today was created at a moment in time, and understanding that broader context of why these policies emerged at the moment that they did. But yes, we have to address exclusionary zoning if we're gonna. It's not the only, again, like what I say about housing justice is there's no silver bullet. So we can't say, oh, if we just change the zoning laws, that's going to fix everything. That it will not fix everything. But it's an important piece of a larger puzzle.
Kirsten, this is Irene. I recently had a conversation with someone who is a homeowner of a land trust home. Mm-hmm. And she shared how that policy has negatively impacted equity building and so forth. So can you speak to that a little bit? Is that one of these policies that would be part of this mapping prejudice or not?
So the land trust, and again, maybe Maria is better suited to answer this question than I am, but land trust was I mean, I know some of the people who brought land trust to Hennepin County, and the intention was to open more doors for affordable housing. I mean, so Maria, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can speak to this. In my life before being an attorney, I actually helped Latino immigrants get mortgages, and I helped people get into land trust homes. You know, land trust is, I think, intended to do two things. One is to be sort of a springboard for people who otherwise would not have any opportunity to enter into a home ownership because they don't have wealth accumulated, and so it's less expensive because essentially you're buying the building and the land is sort of split off and owned by the land trust. So it's less expensive to get into, and then the owners do accumulate some of the equity just on the building, not on the land piece. So they can sell and then use that equity to go into a more traditional home ownership path, and that equity can be their down payment. The other thing that, the other advantage that land trust offers is that it creates a situation of perpetual affordability. And so the land goes into the land trust with a 99-year lease. And the purpose of that, or the thought process behind land trust being a good perpetual homeownership process, is that, you know, traditionally when we give people down payment assistance, that home becomes affordable for that particular purchaser. When that purchaser sells the home is no longer affordable for the next purchaser unless that purchaser also qualifies for down payment assistance. So with land trust, once the home is in the land trust, it can be affordable for 99 years. And actually, I think the lease probably gets renewed every time the home changes hands. So that home then becomes a springboard for many, many different families to jump into more affordable homeownership.
I'd like to ask a question by starting first with a bit of context. So my wife and I moved here 3 years ago to Golden Valley and have been really interested in becoming active members in this community, and moved to Minnesota 4 years ago from Los Angeles, living in very diverse communities, actually, even in the most diverse zip code in all of Los Angeles County, one of the most diverse zip codes in all of the United States, much less the world. And one thing that we've noticed as we've come here is that there's a tremendous amount of resistance, even from people that would completely agree with absolutely everything you said as far as structural racism, the issues with needing to have more equitable opportunities, as well as wanting to move towards equitable outcomes in terms of different demographics. So people would agree with that, and yet in terms of when it comes to their neighborhood, and it's the Yes in My Backyard movement in California, if you've heard of that, when it comes to specifically having policy or action to change their neighborhood, it's like, no, but not here. I wasn't talking about here. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really area where there's a lot of work to be done. Yes, there's a lot of work that can be done as far as, people that are still stuck in thinking that there's fundamental differences between people in very negative, racist, prejudicial ways. That's for sure. There's work that needs to be done there. But I just wanted to first offer that context that as far as we can tell, and we see, as also millennials, I'm 35, my wife's 33, that there's just so many people stuck in that mindset of thinking like it's other people's work to be done. And I'm curious if you could speak to that a little bit, Kirsten, or others that might want to chime in that are, I see the work that you're doing is much more front lines, and I wanted to thank you also for that and appreciate your feedback. We're trying to do what activism we can and donations we can and work we can, but please, I'll leave the mic to you.
Well, thank you for your commitment to, to moving from awareness to action, because I really do think that that is the key at this moment. And Mapping Prejudice is not in a position to say, here's the one action or here's the one silver bullet. It's wanting people to be engaged broadly. So thank you for being engaged in your community and looking for more ways. So, I mean, I think it was very interesting in Minneapolis during the 2040. Were you here during the whole debate over the 2040 plan in Minneapolis at all? Or?
Yes. So we to be honest, we just had a daughter 6 months ago. We also struggled a lot with miscarriages. Just to share that, I mean, it's something that we also feel is important to people to know about. In terms of that's something that's unspoken very often. So we were very focused on personal health since we moved to Minnesota.
Yeah. Still
doing what we can, but honestly, it was kind of like looking at next door, looking at the Golden Valley City Council agendas and feeling like, my gosh, some of it doesn't seem like nearly as big of a deal as people try to talk about. A number of cars that are going at 55 in Winnetka with the density changes that are proposed across the street from the Golden Valley Commons. It's like, it reminds us very much of Parks and Rec, sort of a caricature of city government. Rather than actual, can we all just be reasonable and talk about these things in a more reasonable way?
Yeah, I mean, it's very emotional. I'm pointing to the 2040 debate, which basically consumed Minneapolis during all of 2018. It was the debate over changing the zoning, not even the zoning regulations, but the guidelines for the zoning regulations. And it was the idea was that the city wanted to address a bunch of different things, but primarily racial equity issues through opening the door for new land use policies. And this question consumed the city in 2018. And the city put out this proposal. It got 16,000 written comments. Every on my block, every block in Minneapolis was covered with competing yard signs, and it was very interesting to me to see this group, Neighbors for More Neighbors, grow up, which is exactly that kind of YIMBY group that you're talking about from California. And you know, a lot of those people enter into some pretty heated dialogue with people who were really struggling with what these zoning changes would mean. And I think it's important too in Minneapolis to point out the fact that there was this strange alignment between the wealthiest parts of the city and the poorest parts of the city over the 2040 plan, you know, around the 2040 plan, that people in many parts of North Minneapolis were also really worried about denser development and what it would mean in terms of community control and other things. So I don't mean to say that, you know, I think it's always important to know that these are complex issues, but I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but just to say, yeah, I mean, I think we again, like for me as a historian, it goes back to these land use policies came out of a certain moment in time. They were developed at a certain moment in time for certain reasons. And I think it's important for all of us to really think about, why are we attached to them? Is it emotional? And are they really serving our communities right now in the way that we want? I think that's the frame that I would like people to look at. What kind of community do we want to live in? So, Maria.
This might be a good time for me to jump in and tell you, Thomas, about something that the city of Golden Valley is working on that maybe you could participate in. And I'm going to try to share my screen. So the City Human Rights Commission has been working on a project called the Just Deeds Project. Hold on, let me try to share. So we've got kind of two pieces of this. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
The map that I just showed up? Great. So Mapping Prejudice was kind enough to share all of their data with us. And so the city created this map showing where racial covenants reside in the city of Golden Valley. And you can see some pretty stark patterns. And I'm sure none of you, if you're familiar with the geography of Golden Valley, are surprised by what you see. Because as Kirsten pointed out, these patterns have persisted. I happen to live in one of these neighborhoods in Golden Valley and had a racially restrictive covenant on my home, which is kind of what got me started on this path. And in 2019, the legislature passed a law that allows homeowners to renounce racially restrictive covenants. And so being kind of the nerdy lawyer type, I actually found the covenant on my own when we purchased the house and was struck by it because my husband is from Venezuela. He's a mixed race Latino person. My children are mixed race. And it occurred to me, my grandparents live a mile away, also in Golden Valley. It occurred to me that, you know, at the time my grandparents were buying their home in Golden Valley, my family, we would not have been able to buy a home here. And so we went down this path of discharging our covenant. It's not an easy process. It was a challenge even for me as an attorney who practices real estate law and municipal law. So the Human Rights Commission decided that they would start this project that we're now calling the Just Deeds Project. I'm pretty sure Kirsten actually came up with the name for us. But what we're doing is we're helping people, Golden Valley residents, and we're also collaborating with Robbinsdale. We're hoping to collaborate with many other cities. We have several neighborhoods in Minneapolis that are participating in providing free legal services to help people discharge the covenants on their home. And we're also, we're collaborating with the City Attorneys Association. So we've got city attorneys from all around the state who are donating their time to help people discharge these covenants. And of course, the discharge of the covenant is, it's symbolic at this point, really. The covenant wasn't enforceable, obviously, when my husband and I bought our home here. But it was a really sort of cathartic and empowering experience for us as a family to discharge this covenant. And it also, you know, it created this very strong connection for us to this topic and caused us to want to dive in and work on this more. And so sort of following that vein, the Human Rights Commission decided that the second thing that we're going to focus on for the Just Deeds Project is creating some educational opportunities to continue this conversation. So even, you know, people in Golden Valley who maybe live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a racially restrictive covenant, you can still participate in the Just Deeds Project in the educational piece. In the era of COVID, we're kind of working with Mapping Prejudice to develop some materials so that people can have these discussions, kind of guided discussions about these topics at a neighborhood level, maybe in smaller groups, trying to take all the great work that Mapping Prejudice has done and make it just as accessible as possible for neighborhoods. And the goal of that is, you know, to kind of get at exactly what Thomas was talking about. How do we take what we've learned here and help use it to inform community discussions? And, you know, the goal is to have the facts out there for people so that they can apply them when they are, you know, maybe in Councilmember Rosenquist's case, taking votes and making decisions, or in the rest of us, maybe in our case, communicating what our opinions are about some policies that are before the city council when we talk to the city council, or, you know, learning how to use this information to engage with our neighbors about what our thoughts are about how these policies might impact the city. Another interesting thing to note on this map, you'll see the comment bubbles called out here. Those are all areas where there are properties in the city that the city actually owns that have restrictive covenants. Most of them are parks and open spaces, and they were restricted. They were platted as single-family homes, and at some point were acquired by the city. So, you know, another point of conversation, maybe with the Open Space and Recreation Committee. What does that mean for access to our parks? How does that impact what our programming is in our parks? So, you know, it kind of goes way beyond just where are we building single family homes. But the Human Rights Commission is working on putting much more of this information together on a Golden Valley specific level, and would love to have any and all of you collaborate in that work and help them share that information with the community. So if I will leave my email address and maybe also some more information on the city website about this. And if any of you are interested in pursuing that, we would just love to have your collaboration.
Thank you very much. Yes, please feel free to share information and the chats. I know other people have posted links. I know I've got a little list running for myself of things that I want to do some more research on and looking up. This is absolutely fascinating and truly brings history to present day. Something that often I think we don't see the connection between what happened many years ago and the lives that we lead and the culture that we're in today. So thank you. This has been very enlightening. We are at 1:16. I hate to close this conversation. I really do think this could go on quite a bit longer. Thank you so much, Kirsten and Maria, for sharing. Wonderful questions. Lovely to have so many guests. You are always welcome to join us at Rotary. Betsy does a nice job of all of the invitations weekly are put up on Facebook as well as on our Golden Valley Rotary website. So please feel free to join us at any point. And in closing, we recite the four-way test. And this is the things we think, say, and do. And I have it pulled up. Oh, I don't have it pulled up. Okay, I am going to recite it and not have a picture for it. I apologize. Rotarians, please recite along with me if you wish. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you very much, everybody. This concludes today's Rotary meeting. Hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.